In February 2019, a story unfolded in Kirov that remains one of the most devastating in the region's criminal record. 21-year-old Maria Plenkina locked her 3-year-old daughter Kristina inside their apartment on Schertza Street, turned the key, and walked away. For an entire week. And when the grandmother came on February 20th to wish her granddaughter a happy birthday and opened the door with her own key, the place where a small person lived, she found Kristina on the couch, without clothing, already showing no signs of life. The apartment looked as though no adult had been there for a very long time. Laundry detergent was scattered across the floor, toys and trash were strewn everywhere. The faucets had been shut off, and there was no food or water within reach. The grandmother called an ambulance, though she already understood that help was no longer needed. Investigators arrived shortly after, and the initial examination revealed an important detail. The door was locked from the outside with a key. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of anyone else having been present. Only one question remained. Where had the mother been all this time? That same day, a criminal case was opened, initially just based on the discovery, but within a few hours it became clear that this was anything but an accident. The forensic examination established a preliminary cause: dehydration, starvation, hypothermia. She had been completely alone for days, without water, without food, with the heating turned off. The experts also discovered traces of laundry detergent in her system. Evidently, driven by hunger, she had tried to consume the only thing she could find. February 20th was supposed to be Kristina's 3rd birthday. Instead of a celebration, there was an inspection report. Investigators now had to find the mother and determine where she had been all those days. On the morning of February 20th, Maria made a phone call, not the grandmother calling her. She called the grandmother, and she asked only one thing: when does your workday end? Yulia Plenkina would later be unable to explain precisely what had alarmed her at that moment. Maybe the tone of voice, maybe the very fact of the question, because her daughter rarely asked about her schedule. Or maybe it was that for the entire week, Maria had not once put her granddaughter on the phone, even though that had never happened before. She always said the same thing: everything's fine, we're home, everything's good. And so the grandmother didn't wait for the end of her shift. She called the police and an ambulance to the building on Schertza, and then went there herself. The apartment door was locked, and inside there was a silence that immediately felt wrong. When they opened the door, the first thing that caught the eye was chaos. The temperature inside the apartment was hovering around 59 degrees Fahrenheit, cold and empty. The paramedics documented what the grandmother had apparently already sensed over the phone, and the police began their work. The investigative team began their examination, and what they saw gradually formed an extremely grim picture. On the kitchen table stood 2 empty yogurt bottles, and nothing else. The refrigerator was empty too. As Maria would later say during questioning, she had left her daughter yogurt, a cut-up chicken, and a package of sausages, deciding that this would be enough for 8 days. They had once flooded the neighbor's apartment below. Maria didn't want that to happen again, so there wasn't a single drop of water left in the apartment, not in the faucet, not in the kettle, not in a glass. She locked the door with a key from the outside. No visible injuries were found on Kristina. No bruises, no abrasions. But when they recorded her weight, the number stopped everyone. 18.5 pounds. The normal weight for a 3-year-old is between 28 and 31 pounds, almost half of what it should have been, and the medical team noted in the report signs of extreme emaciation. And that meant only one thing: she hadn't been starving just that week. She had been starving for a long time. The forensic medical examination conclusion stated multi-organ failure. Her body had been shutting down gradually, first the kidneys, then the liver, then everything else. And this process was triggered not by one factor, but by 3 simultaneously: dehydration, starvation, and hypothermia. Each one alone is agonizing, and together they became a death sentence. She hadn't been struck, strangled, or poisoned. No traces of poisoning from the laundry detergent were found in her system either. She was simply left alone, without water and without food, and she faded over the course of several days. On the night between February 16th and 17th, neighbors heard crying. But Christina had cried before, so no one thought anything of it. Between the 17th and 18th, there was already silence. The court would later determine that this was most likely when everything came to an end. When the door was opened on the 20th, signs of decomposition were already visible. 3 days, maybe 4, that's how long she fought. A body at that age is resilient, even when weakened. And Christina had already had a weak heart, anemia, and neurological problems before all this. Her mother had stopped taking her to doctors when her daughter was 8 months old. But every body has its limit, and here's what's important to understand. The friend's apartment where Maria spent that entire week was a 15-minute walk away. She could have come back at any moment, literally any day. At trial, she was asked directly, "Why didn't you come back?" And she answered, "I don't know. I wanted to come in the morning and didn't come. I wanted to come back every day but didn't." She said she was feeling bad because of a breakup with her partner. She didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to go back to where her daughter was waiting. She didn't return once in 7 days, yet during that time she twice took money from her mother, supposedly for feeding her granddaughter, about 2,000 rubles. She spent it at clubs. The first 2 days were probably the easiest. A body at that age can stretch meager supplies for some time, but certainly not for a week. By the 3rd day, the food was gone, and the water even earlier. Christina turned the faucet handles, and nothing happened. At 3 years old, it's impossible to understand why the water isn't flowing, and it's even more impossible to find the shut-off valves. Throughout the entire apartment, there were traces of how she searched, opened cabinets. She crawled around trying to find something edible, something drinkable. In the bathroom, she found laundry detergent, white, looking like something you could put in your mouth. The cold. February. The heating in the apartment was working weakly or not at all. For an adult, that's just uncomfortable. But for a starved and dehydrated body at that age, it's critical. The fact that Christina was found without clothing was no coincidence. In severe hypothermia, a paradoxical reaction occurs. The person feels hot and begins to undress. It's called paradoxical undressing, and it indicates the final stage before the end. Maria had left the windows cracked open. Probably didn't think about it or thought about something else. So it wouldn't be stuffy, so the air would circulate. February. But whether the apartment could have warmed up doesn't matter. What matters is something else. The windows stayed cracked the entire time, and Christina understood this. She climbed onto the windowsill at 3 years old, took her toys and threw them down, one by one, out the window onto the street. This wasn't a game. This was her only connection to the outside world. Below, right beneath the apartment, there was a shop. The saleswomen saw toys falling from above. They heard someone crying upstairs, but they didn't think anything of it. Who knows what causes that sort of thing? And the toys, maybe someone dropped them, lost them, or was just fooling around. These things happen. No one went upstairs, no one called, no one asked. The grandmother would later say at trial, if someone had told her then that her granddaughter was throwing toys from the window, she would have raised the alarm with both the police and Child Protective Services. But no one told her, and Christina kept throwing them, as long as she had the strength, as long as she could climb onto the windowsill. Then she stopped. The investigation interviewed the building's residents on Scherza Street, and the result wasn't exactly shocking. It was entirely predictable. The family had lived there for about 4 years and barely interacted with neighbors. Maria sometimes smoked in the stairwell. That's when they'd say hello. A young mother, her daughter still very small. No one had noticed anything suspicious. And here's what's important. The family was not registered as troubled. The children's ombudsman of the Kirov region, Vladimir Shabardin, confirmed that no reports had been filed with Child Protective Services, no complaints, no inspections, nothing at all. But there was another signal, quiet and invisible. Christina had stopped showing up at the clinic. From birth until 8 months, she had regular checkups, and then not a single one. No monitoring, not a single vaccination, not a single visit to a pediatrician. After the tragedy, the prosecutor's office conducted an inspection and opened a case for negligence. They detained the head of Clinic Number 7, Tamara Permyakova, but released her 3 days later because they found no grounds for charges. And the doctors at the Children's Diagnostic Center, in protest, submitted their resignations. So the system turned out not to be at fault. There was seemingly no one to blame, except the mother. At her friend Anastasia Kuprina's place, Maria felt right at home. Her toothbrush was there, her pajamas were hanging up, and she had often stayed overnight even before that week. From February 13th to 20th, Maria was essentially living a normal life. She helped her friend with a move, because the friend happened to be switching apartments. She went to cafes with her, went to clubs, looked for a job. In 2018, she had worked at a hookah lounge on Moskovskaya Street, but by February she was already unemployed. She went to the hairdresser, showed the stylist photos of her daughter, talked about Christina, and whenever she was asked who the daughter was with at the moment, her answers changed every time. With the grandmother, with a friend, with the godmother. Everything's fine. Someone's watching her. Anastasia Kuprina did not know that Christina was actually alone. At trial, she would say that Maria assured her each time that her daughter was being looked after, and there was simply no reason not to believe her. The outings were paid for by the friend, while Maria brought food to her friend's home with the money she received from her own mother. Clubs, taxis, alcohol, all at Anastasia's expense. Plenkina's friends told investigators something else as well. Maria had repeatedly thought out loud, maybe give Christina up to a children's home? Not once, not as a joke. She seriously considered it. Anastasia Kuprina would say at trial, there was nothing unusual about Maria's behavior. And that's the important part. Nothing unusual. An ordinary week, ordinary conversations, an ordinary friend going through a breakup and looking for work. Maria lied easily, you could say professionally, without a single seam. To her mother, the daughter is fine. To her friend, someone is watching the daughter. To the hairdresser, everything is great. To acquaintances at the club, the daughter is with the grandmother. A different version for everyone, and not a single slip. At her friend's place, she would simply disappear, and where she went, nobody knew. At trial, she suddenly claimed there was a man, a secret one, older than her, and she had been hiding him from everyone because her mother disapproved. Supposedly, she spent one of the nights outside the city at his place. The problem is that the cell phone data showed she never left the city. Another lie, or another secret. Journalist Ivan Shvetsov, who attended the proceedings, later wrote, "Every time the court catches her in a lie, she changes her testimony. More and more food keeps appearing in her recollections of what she left her daughter. So the versions multiplied, but the facts didn't. The only fact that never changed, 7 days, not a single call home, not a single attempt to check. 2 days after the discovery, the detention. The investigators had prepared themselves for hysterics, for tears, for denial, for attempts to explain, to justify, to shift the blame onto someone else. But none of that happened. Maria sat calmly, hands on her knees, her voice steady. She answered to the point. Yes, she left. Yes, she locked the door. Yes, she understood that her daughter was alone. During questioning, she partially admitted guilt and said she hadn't wanted this outcome. She simply left and didn't come back. The investigation ordered a comprehensive psychological and psychiatric evaluation, and the conclusion was later read aloud in court. The wording was dry, clinical, absorbed in her own problems. Empathy and compassion for those close to her are absent. And here's the key finding. Sane. No intellectual disability, no mental disorders. Fully capable of understanding the consequences of her actions. This was not an illness, not a clouded state of mind, not a fit of passion. She understood what she was doing. Alexei gave an interview to REN TV 2 days after what happened became known. He explained that at first he didn't acknowledge his daughter, then he did, and then he left. 1 month after the birth. Why? According to him, the decision was mutual. Did he help after that? No, he didn't. He moved to St. Petersburg and last saw Christina in 2016, when she was less than a year old. 3 years without a single visit. He explained this by saying he wanted to come in November 2018, but Maria wouldn't let him see his daughter. Every time he asked for a visit, she answered the same way. "You have your life, we have ours. Everything is fine with us." He wanted to take Christina to Petersburg for good, to raise her himself. Maria refused and threatened. If he took her, she would file a police report for kidnapping. The result is a paradox. She didn't want to raise the child, yet she wouldn't give her up, not to the father, not to the state. Why? That remains unclear. Something important. The last exchange of messages with Maria was dated the evening of February 17th. She refused at that moment. At that time, Christina was still alive, and it was likely the last or second to last day. On Alexei's social media page, there was not a single mention of his daughter. His status read, "All good." All good. So Maria was left alone at 18, without a husband, without a job, without an education. She never finished culinary school, where she'd been studying to become a pastry chef. The only source of money was her mother, who was supporting both her daughter and her granddaughter entirely. She gave money for food, for clothes, for the apartment. They lived together, all three of them, until Christina was about a year old. And then there was yet another fight, and Yulia moved out. Not to another apartment, to a dormitory. But she didn't disappear. She called every day, came by 2 or 3 times a week, gave money. The same money that Maria then spent at clubs. At trial, Maria's attorney presented a different version of this story. According to her, after the move, the grandmother practically stopped coming around. When asked to look after her granddaughter, she'd respond, "You're the one who gave birth. You deal with it." And she refused to hold the child. "She's so small, I'm afraid." She stayed with Christina once, and never again. Yet she regularly gave money for feeding her granddaughter. Maria wasn't employed, scraping by with odd jobs at clubs and cafes. A strange arrangement takes shape. Complete financial dependence alongside near-total emotional disconnection. Plenkina would later tell journalists, "I didn't notice anything suspicious in my daughter's behavior. If this was deception, then it went on for 3 years. I don't know." Alexei, in a conversation with the TV channel 360, recalled that Maria used to be completely different. Domestic, stayed at home, friends came to visit her rather than her disappearing somewhere. "I don't know what happened in her life, what changed. Something broke, or someone broke her." And here's another detail that emerged during the investigation: Maria Plenkina's prior conviction. Even before her daughter was born, she had been charged with credit fraud under Article 159, Part 1 of the Russian Criminal Code. A classic scheme. She'd apply for loans with false information about income and employment, receive the money, and vanish. The grandmother would later tell journalists that the conviction had been one of the signs of her daughter's antisocial behavior, but at the time she hadn't given it much thought. Now came a second conviction, and no longer about money. And here's what's noteworthy. During the investigation, Maria tried to employ the same method that had worked before: manipulation. She claimed she didn't return home because voices in her head demanded it. She tried to simulate a mental disorder. It didn't work. Then she switched tactics. She partially admitted guilt, said she loved her daughter. Her testimony kept changing. One version would fall apart, and another would immediately take its place. Investigators noted that she was adapting, searching for which explanation would be accepted, so the system she was accustomed to using for her own benefit didn't yield this time. January 17th, 2020. The Kirov Regional Court. Almost a year had passed since the tragedy. The courtroom was full of journalists, cameras, microphones, a case the entire city knew about. Maria Plenkina sat in the defendant's dock, calm and detached. The judge read through the case materials, photographs of the apartment, the shut-off valves, Christina's condition at the time of discovery. Prosecutor Anna Kravitz demanded 13 years and 3 months in a general regime penal colony, plus a fine, plus restricted freedom after release. The charge? Causing the death of a minor child with particular cruelty. Nothing remarkable, an ordinary girl, an ordinary student. But then the data about her family came up, and this was the first time it was stated aloud. Maria's own father had been incarcerated. Her mother had moved to a dormitory. Christina's father had left for another city. Maria's father was behind bars. The neighbors heard crying and didn't call the police. The doctors hadn't seen Christina for 2 years and didn't raise the alarm. The judge listed everyone who could have intervened and didn't. Plenkina's attorney did not show up for the sentencing. Maria was given the floor, and she began to speak. But her speech immediately became disjointed, confused. She jumped from thought to thought, called her daughter Krestyusha, and cried, "I acknowledge my guilt because I left my daughter alone. I didn't wish this upon her. There was no personal animosity. I loved her very much and did everything so she'd have everything she needed. I took care of her. Why didn't she come back?" She didn't answer. She couldn't articulate it. She was asked the key questions. How could you leave your daughter without water? Why were you gone for 8 days? Who was watching Christina? And she gave no coherent answer to any of them. People in the courtroom exchanged glances, and someone said aloud, "She's crying because she's afraid for her own life." So the tears were there. But the explanation was not. The floor was given to the defense attorney. The lawyer tried to do what the defendant herself could not: explain. Maria broke under the weight of financial and everyday hardships, which is why she says she couldn't come back. The attorney read out the mitigating circumstances. Maria's father passed away when she was still little. After that, her mother gave her little attention. Early intimate relations, pregnancy at 17. When Maria told her mother she was pregnant, the response was, "You need to get an abortion." No discussion. Plenkina was essentially left alone with her daughter and without support. There was no financial help from the father. The mother avoided helping care for her granddaughter. Women in the courtroom quietly expressed their indignation, ___, quote, _3, __, the attorney concluded and requested the minimum sentence. And then the judge interrupted her. Under Article 105, "Have you coordinated this position with your client?" The attorney hesitated. Yes, she acknowledges the objective consequences of her actions, but without intent involving particular cruelty. The judge announced a 15-minute recess to allow the defense to coordinate its position with the defendant. A rare moment. Even the attorney, it seemed, didn't fully understand what exactly she was defending. And here's what the expert's conclusion means. Everything she did with a sound mind. She shut off the water. She understood why. She left for a week. She knew whom she was leaving behind. She didn't come back. She was aware of the consequences. The experts didn't document an illness. They documented a personality, a person who is capable of caring only about themselves, who doesn't feel others' pain, who will always find someone to blame, and it will be anyone but themselves. But that's not a diagnosis. That's character. And character is not a mitigating circumstance. Psychiatrists have long studied such mothers. British psychotherapist Anna Motts, an expert in forensic psychology, describes them this way: women who perceive their own daughters and sons not as separate individuals, but as extensions of themselves, a narcissistic extension, an object, a function. Another specialist, Estella Weldon, spent years working with mothers who caused harm to those closest to them, and her conclusion is chilling. For such women, violence against their own offspring is a symbolic attack on the body of their own mother, revenge, settling scores. And that's when everything begins to fall into place. Christina was never a living person with needs in Maria's eyes. She was an accessory, a backdrop for photographs, a reason to get money from the grandmother, a tool for manipulating the father. She was her property, not a person, but a thing. When the thing became inconvenient, Maria didn't do what she's accused of in the conventional sense. She simply switched her daughter off in her mind. She literally stopped thinking about her. For 7 days, she lived her own life, and Christina didn't exist in her head as a living being who could fade away. The birthday post on social media wasn't cynicism, and it wasn't madness. It was a performance. She wasn't congratulating her daughter. She was showing the world the image of a good mother. The audience mattered more than reality, and the grandmother finding Christina on her birthday, that was perhaps no coincidence. Between Maria and her own mother, there was hostility, conflicts, separation, fights. The blow was meant to land on the grandmother. The granddaughter became a weapon in that war. On March 23, 2020, the Fourth Court of Appeals in Nizhny Novgorod reviewed the defense's appeal. The sentence was upheld, 13 years in a general regime penal colony. Maria Plenkina will be released at approximately age 35. Christina will forever remain 3. She threw toys from the window. She hoped someone would see, but no one did. What do you think about this story? Write in the comments, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel. See you next time.